was the Massachusetts folks that started this off, where they'd go into meetings and they'd always get the, well, this might be bad for the economy. Well, this might raise the cost of living. And in a time of unemployment like we have, we need about 8 million jobs in this country to get back to true full employment. That's a completely fair criticism. And high energy prices are a hardship by themselves, and the carbon tax is an implicit higher energy price. So what Kathy did, she's a trained economist from Washington, she called us up and asked, can you do a study on the Massachusetts state carbon tax with the idea of not so much is it going to be good, but how bad is it going to be? Can we make a value judgment that we can give up a little bit to gain a lot in the climate sense? And when I actually ran the thing, a lot of you probably have seen this, and all the white papers and reports and stuff are online, it actually does come out positive. Slightly so in context, but it does come out positively. And I spent a long time combing through the inputs, combing through the code, going through my firm and other firms to make sure everything made sense, and it did. So that was the start of it. Kathy eventually commissioned another study for the state of Washington State. Got us in contact with CCL. We did a California report a couple months ago. And then I got a phone call in from Peter Fikowski a couple months ago that says we want to do this big national one. Took me a couple months, a lot of weekends, worked all the way over Memorial Day weekend when I was home. But it's done, and now we can actually go through it for all of you here. So. But what I did was essentially that 2-page CCL proposal on a national carbon fee and dividend. So it starts in 2016. The assumption being is you have a couple years to get it implemented, even if it was to pass this year. It's $10 per metric ton of carbon dioxide, CO2. Not carbon equivalency, carbon dioxide only. It escalates at a linear rate of $10 per year, starting in 16, through at least 2035, and continuing on after that, for that matter. And it's at the point of extraction. It's the point it comes out of the mine, it's the point it comes out of the well, it's the point it enters the economy. So that's an important point, because that makes this very different than, say, a gas tax or a retail carbon tax, which is what most states would probably discuss. And it makes the modeling a little more complicated than what we did in the state modeling, for those of you who may be familiar with that. We take 100% of that money, and we refund it to all American households with a monthly check or direct deposit. We all probably remember in 2001 and 2003 that we all got rebate checks from the federal government, supposedly as a stimulus act when the economy was a little bit shaky. IRS does that kind of stuff semi-regularly. I kind of imagined it like that. I will clarify, I'm not putting any money in here for quote-unquote, I guess you'd say, administration, either on the assessment or the back end redistributing the money side. But for context, the federal government's budget's trillions. It's like 3 to 5 to 6 trillion, depending on what you count as the federal budget. And IRS's budget's 10 billion. So we're talking an order of thousands difference, or an order of 10,000s difference between the size of the budgets. So it's a very small effect if it was included anyways. I'm just kind of assuming that it's part of their underlying mission as it would change over the next 20 years. The refund size, I kind of think of it as a point system. If you're an adult over 18, you get 1 point. If you're an adult with a child under 18 that's dependent on you, you get a half of a point up to 2 children. So you can get to 1 point from child, and then it's distributed on a per capita basis. Monthly, I'll note that as well as 1, to increase visibility, and 2, it aids in the transition because nobody has to carry a balance on their carbon fee for longer than 31 days. As opposed to if you did it annually, then they'd have to carry a balance for a year, which is a larger deal in a lot of cases. Another new kind of wrinkle to this is a concept called a border adjustment. The idea of this is you can't import equivalent goods from the rest of the world that have not been taxed in the carbon sense. Think of 2 pieces of steel, one's made in Indiana and one's made in, say, India. If you put a carbon tax on the steel in the United States, that increases the price to produce it, therefore the price to sell it. In theory, you could flood the market with cheap foreign imports and drive American prices down, increase net net emissions from a world perspective, and drive down American competitiveness. So what I did here is there's a methodology for calculating what's the implied carbon content of imports inside of our model from other parts of the world. So in theory, you carbon tax that piece of steel from Indiana, and as that piece of steel comes in from India, Port LA, Long Beach, wherever, it gets carbon taxed at the border, so the price differential stays the same, so in theory, nobody's disadvantaged from a competitive standpoint. This is a complicated issue, both from the administration standpoint and the legal standpoint. I'm not going to get into the WTO issues with this. I'm just assuming that those make their way to a happy resolution. We're able to do this kind of thing. So what that does, as I said, is it preserves American competitiveness. That is, higher energy prices don't necessarily affect our business standing in the rest of the world. And it also means that these emission reductions don't leak. You don't have a car factory right across the border in Canada who takes the place of one from Michigan that can emit as freely as it wants to and then imports the cars in the United States that have to pay that border fee. Most of you in this audience are probably pretty familiar with the basis of the carbon tax, but I decided to make a flow chart to talk everybody through it and give an exact idea of what's inside the modeling. I know, like the clip art. Mark didn't tell this story, but before I was doing this, I was in grad school teaching, and because you're a grad student and a master's candidate, you get 8 a.m. classes, because Lord knows the professors aren't doing that. So you're a much better audience than the hungover freshmen I typically had to deal with. So it all starts really in one place, and it's the sun, top left. Because if you really think about fossil fuels, they start with the sun as well, because they're, chemically transformed biological products from the Mesozoic area, and they came from the sun in the first place as well. But for this, we're going to start with 2 places, the sun and the earth. We start with the earth in this case, and I have that little blue arrow there. That's the carbon tax. That's where this all starts. As we take it out of the ground, or we take it off the seafloor, wherever it is taxed based on what implied carbon content it has. Just to give everybody a little rule of thumb here, a gallon of gasoline, just normal petrol gasoline, weighs about 6 pounds. When you burn it and you add oxygen to it, it weighs about 18, 19 pounds. So yes, you're adding about 12 pounds of oxygen to it from the air. If you do the math to convert that into metric tons, it ends up working out such that a dollar per metric ton of carbon tax is it's a little bit less than, but it's basically a cent per gallon. So if we have a $100 carbon tax, it's as if we're adding $1 to the cost of retail gasoline. That's going to work its way downstream in our case, because we're starting at the point of extraction, but that's the kind of idea that we're doing. We're increasing the price of energy. So we do the blue thing into fossil fuels. So what starts happening? We go down red. We get less fossil energy. I put a coal plant there and a little gas can there, because those are the 2 major emission sources inside of this country. We get less of that, because it's more expensive to do that. We also turn around and we get this big fee and dividend thing that we wouldn't have otherwise. We have this green thing, that's good, that's positive, that's higher than it would be. And that money goes straight back to households. So now we've got this one arm, other arm thing going on. Now we've got Harry Truman's complaint. We have the red effects starting from fossil fuels and going over towards households and industries. That's the effect of higher energy costs. Let's not kid ourselves. Higher energy costs would have a negative effect. This is a net analysis. This is the creation versus the destruction. I'm not trying to say it's all good. And there are some dark spots in this analysis, as there is in any economic policy. So we do increase the cost of living. We do increase the cost of energy. But we also, while doing that, if you go down and to the left, to the emissions, to the smokestacks, because we're decreasing the consumption of fossil energy, we're also decreasing emissions from that fossil energy. And that's not just carbon dioxide. When you tax carbon dioxide, you're going to catch a lot of other stuff. You're going to catch mercury from coal plants, you're going to catch NOx and SOx, nitrous oxide, and sulfur dioxide from top car tailpipes and power plants. And those have air quality issues. Those are regulated by EPA, those cause emphysema, those cause instances of asthma. So that goes down to an air quality improvement, the little cloud on the bottom there. But now we've done the downside stuff. But remember, we're taking this idea of households have higher costs for energy, but they also have this rebate check coming to them. And they're going to spend it, eventually. They may save some initially on the margin, but eventually it's all going to get spent. Some of it's going to get spent to make up for the higher cost of energy, but some of it's going to get spent on other stuff. That goes to the bottom corner with industries. Industries are going to do 2 things with the money. They have more customers walking in and taking, buying their products of some sort. They're going to spend it on their supply chain. Again, a car has an incredibly long supply chain behind it, including tires, electronics, engines, parts, raw aluminum and steel, leather, all that kind of stuff. And then they're also going to hire people. They're going to bring labor inputs into the system because they have to have somebody to produce this thing. They're going to have somebody to operate their shop, all these different ideas. And that labor is going to go back to households. They're going to take that wage money and they're going to respend it. It's going to go back inside the industry and it's going to go back inside the economy. So that's what's happening on really on the economic side. The other side of it, this is really more Synapse's job than mine, but I can't speak to most of the results, is because fossil energy, and I mostly mean coal and natural gas electricity generation here, is more expensive because the input fuel for it's more expensive, it changes the relative price. It changes the business decision, the cost-benefit analysis of building that type of energy as opposed to building its alternatives. So essentially you have this capital concept here. The idea of putting capital into fossil fuel generation is not nearly attractive as it used to be because it's more expensive to do because of the carbon fee and dividend. Therefore, they're going to take that money and they're going to throw it in more on the margin into renewable energy. I put a solar panel and a wind farm up there, though there would actually be a big role to play by nuclear power in the way we have it here as well. And that's, at least on the margin, it's not free, you have to build the system, but it doesn't have a price effect because it's coming from the sun. Wind comes from the sun, solar comes from the sun. So what we have here is a net effect of whatever bad is done to the economy with higher energy prices versus whatever good is done by refunding the money, and then we have a change inside the power sector because we changed the relative price of different technologies and different plants. So that's the basic idea from a conceptual standpoint of what's inside this study. The mathematics of it get a little more complicated and spiderwebby than this if you really want to look at the diagram I have in a few slides, but this is exactly how it's put together. Here's employment by region. The unit's thousands, so 700,000, 600,000. And actually, when you do it as a simulation in the way we're describing in all different regions, with the exception of West, South, Central, which is Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana, it's positive. And even in that Gulf Coast, Southwest region, it's very, very close to zero. It's initially a little bit higher and eventually a little bit lower. That is, on the whole, on the net, given the simulations that I've done and the conditions that I've described to you for the last 15, 20 minutes, it actually is a net creator of employment relative to the baseline. So, this is the regional effect. We can see that it's bigger in the coastal areas, particularly California, though it actually has a better long-term effect in parts of the southern and the western and midwestern United States. We'll get into some of those trends in a second. This is the big number for the nation. So this column graph, up to 2.8 million, is just the sum of all these, added up into each other. So it depends on the year you're talking about, but 2025, say a 10-year window, it's something like 2.1, 2.2 million jobs relative to baseline. And then if you get to the 2035 window, it's something like 2.8 million jobs relative to the baseline. Now I do want to put this number in context though, because the United States economy right now has about 180 million jobs. Adding 2 million to that is a lot. Like that's 2 million people, roughly speaking. But it's also, because the United States economy is so large, it's trillions of dollars, it's hundreds of millions of people, on the margin it's a small percentage. It really is not that big of a change relative to the size of the whole entire economy. And if anything, the way I think about a lot of these results is it's just saying is that it's close to zero with an upward bias or an upward result, and this is what we're getting on these kind of things. Here's gross regional product. So this is the output. This is the size of the economy. This is GDP, but for the regions. And same kind of pattern here. It's positive in pretty much all the regions, with, of course, 2 exceptions. One being East, South, Central, which is the area basically from Louisville and Lexington, Kentucky to the Gulf Coast, Mobile, Alabama. Decent amount of energy production there, and you also have the coal fields in Eastern Tennessee and Eastern Kentucky to talk about. The big loser, of course, is the West, South, Central region, Texas and Oklahoma. I realize this is a negative number. Nobody really wants to see that kind of stuff, but we are being intellectually honest about this. This is the energy, oil and gas intensive part of the United States. It probably don't need a model to tell you that they're the ones most at risk when you do something like this policy out there. Therefore, they have the negative impact. But remember my story a second ago about contextualizing this kind of stuff. Well, let's do that. Here's the United States impact. So this is for all those regions summed up. Even if you have the negative of the blue line there for West, South, Central, it's still positive on the net for everybody. So contextualizing it, I just told my little story about 180 million a second ago, but for all regions, even the best region, that ends up being East, North, Central, is still a less than 2% impact to employment. But again, because we have such a massive economy, 2% is a pretty big deal. We're an economy at the scale where a fraction of a percent is a big deal. Therefore, these are large changes. The only region that's really flat is, again, West, South, Central. The United States average is close to 1%, maybe a little bit more than that. So it's a 1% increase in employment relative to a baseline. GDP is similar, but not as large. And keep that in mind. You get more jobs than you get output. You get more jobs than you get GDP. They don't track with each other, and there's good reasons for that. I'll get to that in a second. And like I said a second ago, even though West, South, Central looks kind of strident because it's so negative, it's below the baseline, put it in context, it's still less than 2%. It's not completely a destruction of the economy, it's a slight decrease in its potential over the long term. And just to prove that point, remember my baseline alternative slide? This is this slide, but it's only real data now. GDP on the left is what happens in the United States. And then look at West South Central. Again, Texas and Oklahoma. You can definitely see the blue line in this case, but it's a very, very small separation. It is negative, but in context, it's not like, you know, the region has itself absolutely devastated or changed forever. Again, you don't need a model to tell you this is probably not the best thing to ever happen to petroleum refineries. But look at the flip side, the top half of this. This is where the consumer spending goes. Healthcare and social assistance, which is a very broad category. It includes hospitals, includes clinics, it includes a lot of nonprofits and philanthropy kind of stuff. Finance and insurance, which has a lot of transactional things going on. Retail, which is direct consumer spending. Real estate and construction. Construction is a little further down, which is housing related. Information, which is media. Other services, accommodation and food services, hotels, restaurants, kind of vacation oriented things. When people take their money and they spend it, it goes into all these other industries. And I'm giving away my answer in a second, but think about how much employment actually exists in each one of these industries. The oil and gas supply chain, just to give some numbers, and I won't pretend these are perfectly accurate, but they're close. Approximately 100,000 people in the United States works for coal mining, so 100,000. Approximately 400,000 work for power generation. Approximately 700,000 work for oil and gas extraction, actually in the fields or pipeline transportation. And approximately 100,000 work for petroleum refineries, mostly in California, Texas, and Louisiana. That in total, depending on exactly how you define it, is between 1 and 2 million. The whole economy is 180 million jobs. Anybody want to guess how many people work in healthcare in this country?
4.
Anybody? 20 million. 10 times what work actually for fossil energy generation. About 18 million work for retail trade. About 9 million work for construction. About 8 million still work for manufacturing. Despite all the press you've seen about manufacturing's decline in the United States, there's still 8 million people that work for those industries. We're encouraging industries that are service-related and consumer spending and household-related, while slightly, in some cases, damaging industries that are energy-related. But the former is very labor-intensive and about providing direct services to individuals, and the latter is incredibly capital-intensive. Not many people work for it. This is another one of these fun ones like that. The whole Bakken thing, the Williston, North Dakota, Eastern Montana thing, depending on how you count the jobs from that, it's between 30 and 100,000, roughly, depending if you count like the spin-off jobs at the McDonald's in Williston. In a month in the United States, the economy adds between 150 and 250,000 jobs, which means the whole Bakken oil thing is about 2 or 3 weeks worth of job creation. We'd have to have that happen a couple hundred times in order to get our economy back to full employment. It's great media, you get some great stories at Boom Bust, Wild West economics out there, but it's just not that big. It just doesn't have that much labor attached to it, as opposed to healthcare, finance, or information, which employ a lot of us, probably a lot of the people in this room for that matter, find your industry, and it's incredibly labor intensive. Now, there is one dark spot here, and you probably all saw it, it's manufacturing. Let's talk about what that actually means. There's a quirk, I'm going to call it a quirk politely. I'm not disparaging it, this is just the way it's set up. That petroleum refineries and the feedstock, natural gas, and chemicals for that are considered manufacturing in the NAICS code. That's the way census sets it up. Which means that almost all of the loss of output for manufacturing is from petroleum refineries. That's that bottom category, petroleum and coal products, is basically petroleum refining. If you take them out, and you also take out chemical manufacturing's loss, because that's the feedstock natural gas that goes into refineries. So pretend the bottom 2 lines don't exist, and then add up the yellow lines above that. It's pretty close to 0. Yeah. There are some industries that are still going to lose, like primary metals is steel and aluminum, that's pipes. So they're not building as many pipes for pipelines and extraction and refineries that they would. Electrical equipment and appliances, because that industry is very, very, very likely to move itself around. It's so cost conscious and it's done overseas a lot. But flip it around and look at the top. Motor vehicles, automotive manufacturing, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, that whole supply chain actually comes out positively for this, because what do people buy with themselves? After your house, what's your basic expense? Your car. you buy more of them, or you replace them more often because the cost of owning them is higher. You know, you can defiantly drive that 1990 Camry as long as you want to, but it probably doesn't get the mileage that the 2015 does. You have a little more incentive to move up on that. That money makes its way back to that industry. Food, same deal. And also note that this is a small piece of good news for the agricultural industry, because a lot of us spend our money on food. You know, low-income families, a lot of their money goes to groceries. Higher-income people, if they have more money all of a sudden, they're going to go eat out more, they're going to go more restaurants, they're going to kind of outsource, quote-unquote, food preparation duties to private industry. And when a restaurant buys that, or a grocery store needs it, they're going to get it from a wholesaler, and they're going to get it eventually from a rancher or a farmer. So that does make its way back to agriculture in some small way. You can even work your way down to probably my favorite one, which is wood, which is basically furniture. So it works its way down to other industries as well. Here's jobs by industry. And I kind of already talked over my stuff for this slide a moment ago, but notice that with mining, which is again, oil and gas extraction and coal mining, it's only about 100,000 jobs less. And this is 100,000 jobs over the course of 20 years, relative to a baseline, so put it in some context. While the job creation to industries that are incredibly labor intensive, like retail, healthcare, and social assistance, is very, very high. Some people ask me why the healthcare is so large. It's two answers. One, it's an incredibly labor intensive industry, and two, when you have people living longer, which you actually do because of the carbon tax, instead of dying of respiratory ailments in your 50s and 60s, you die of chronic ailments in your 70s and 80s and 90s. It's the old kind of, smokers are good for insurance companies because they die sooner. So actually, in some cases, this healthcare is a good sign. It's because we have the privilege to live long enough to get that sick and be taken care of. But it's also a happy story, but at the same time, that's really labor intensive. There's a lot of home health aides and a lot of people in the medical community, and my fiance is in med school right now for that matter, so there it is.